everyone, Ariel Adams here with the Superlative Podcast. Please listen to aBlogtoWatch's other podcast, aBlogtoWatch Weekly, where we talk about the latest news and reviews. Today on Superlative, my guest is David Silver. He is the owner of the Vintage Watch Company in London, and he specializes in vintage Rolex and pretty much only vintage Rolex. Is that right, David?
That's it. Largest collection in the world of vintage Rolex, pure and exclusive.
Now, it's not surprising to me now, but I think when I would have started as a watch lover, I would have been somewhat, maybe not shocked, but amused that there was a store dedicated to just vintage Rolex. And it's not just you. There are others out there. But how old is the concept of a retail watch store specializing in not just vintage, but vintage of just one brand? Is that a relatively new concept?
I wouldn't say it was relatively new, but it was an idea born from my father 30 years ago now. So we're celebrating our 30th anniversary this year.
Congrats.
Thank you very much. And it didn't start exclusive, if I'm honest. So my father had always been in jewelry as his business, and he'd sold a large business and had not a lot to do. So he started as a kind of hobby. And he created a counter around this size of mixed vintage pieces. Vintage at the time, 30 years ago, was becoming quite a big thing. Vintage Chanel, vintage Hermes was creeping into the fashion market. And this concept of vintage was coming back very strongly. And he had this idea that he would, put together some watches of varying brands. And we had vintage Hamiltons, vintage Omega, vintage Patek Philippe, and Rolex, obviously. And then over a very short period of time, it became evident that the branding of the name Rolex was just beyond all the others. So the Rolexes would outsell everything else. So the eureka moment was, could I put together a collection of one brand, vintage, as a very strong alternative to modern Rolex at the time? And that's kind of how we started.
You interface with the consumer a lot, so I think it's fair to ask you this question. What is it about Rolex which resonates so well with consumers? You and I know there's other good watches out there. There's other great stories out there, but Rolex undeniably has an affinity with consumers that is really unparalleled. In your opinion, what accounts for that?
So the most important thing to realize with Rolex is it is a luxury brand, but its strength is up there with all brands in the world. You're talking about Coca-Cola, Kellogg's, Pepsi, some of the most iconic brands in the world. Rolex ranks amongst all of them, and their price points are so far apart. It's extraordinary. So why? The question is simple. It's its history, its allure, it's the famous people that wore them over the years. It's Paul Newman, it's cinema, it's sporting achievements. They just have got it, and it's a sexy brand.
I think it's interesting because, the watch industry as we know it, according to a lot of measures, is propped up by Rolex. And this is such an important concept that other brands sometimes like to forget. And for example, people first learn about Rolex and then maybe learn about another brand. And if Rolex wasn't there to get them into luxury watches in the first place, many people would not even know that that's a thing. And so Rolex serving the purpose as a gateway. Of course, there's many people that don't move beyond Rolex, but Rolex serving as a gateway is so crucial to the existence of not just other big name brands, but also a whole slew of independents that benefit from people that become watch lovers. Not everyone gets through Rolex, but as you said, it's so popular from a numeric standpoint around the world. Even though its products cost so much more than Coca-Cola, in a lot of ways, it's just as popular as something which any person can afford. And that's rare.
Yes. So it's aspirational as a brand. So if you feel that you have been able to buy your first Rolex, you've achieved something. So there's that whole build up. People work their whole careers to get to that point of owning their first Daytona piece, be it old or new. So that has an achievement status. I think the Wolf of Wall Street concept of the 80s, Rolex was so embedded in that. The Rolex President watch, the Day. If you had that gold Rolex in a meeting boardroom, you'd made it. You were doing well. So obviously that has that sort of concept. And then as a gift giving, it has a perceived value. So everyone knows they're being given something quite important. And it's a hand-me-down for sure. So that starts the next generation of lovers, if you like.
So you have to be able to afford it, but it's safe, meaning people feel that it's popular enough that other people want it. So there's a validation behind it. And it has a stickiness, right? It sort of always has value. And even if you don't want it, someone in your family will want it later in life because Rolex remains popular. And I guess I'm just trying to talk about this because I think it merits repeating, because we talk about watches, at least on aBlogtoWatch, all day long. And sometimes people forget exactly how Rolex has captured the imagination of the world in a way that most watch brands haven't. In fact, arguably every other watch brand combined has not captured the imagination of the world like Rolex. Is that something that consumers come in knowing, or do you sometimes have to impress that upon them, or do they feel like it's a big deal, but they're not really sure why Rolex is? I'm just curious how much consumers even know about the brand.
I think more than ever, of all generations, of all, sexes. It's a cross-border brand. There are, more exclusive pieces in other companies, if you like, but they're niche and not a lot of people know. If you just walk up and down the Bones and Arcade, which is behind us, any given day at lunchtime and ask 100 people to name a watch brand, I will guarantee you in the very high 80 to 90% would be Rolex, every single person. It's just one of those brands. It's beyond watchmaking. It's just a symbol like Chanel.
Do you feel that consumers know something beyond that? Like, do they understand the history of Rolex, maybe some of the models? Like, I know that the Rolex name is obviously extremely well known, but how much do they know deeper than that?
I would say, very little, but now more so. So I would say over the last 5 years, Rolex have definitely gone back over their history. There's a change of direction in terms of marketing. I think it's very clear that they are very interested in their past and pushing that forward. They didn't used to do that. When we first started, Rolex's own website had very little in terms of history on their
almost nothing at all.
They, the key iconic moments in their past were almost irrelevant to them. And I think that was always sad. So that was the side that we were able to kind of exploit in a way, because we gave everybody a representation of where this brand had come from. And there were pieces from the 1920s, 1930s that just looked so alien to be a Rolex, but they were, they have the history is incredible.
So I imagine that over the past 30 years, the way that you've acquired these vintage Rolex watches has changed. Talk about the early years. Where did these watches come from before they ended up in the showcase?
I would say a lot of the time locally sourced pieces then. In London, the UK was quite a strong market for vintage at the time. I think that's waned over the years, but, definitely then. Auctions a lot, the auction profile of customer has changed enormously as well. So in those days, it was purely trade, particularly in watches. Watches were thrown into watch catalogs, very badly displayed. It was almost a non-event in the kind of auction arena. It was all about art, or the watches, and even the jewelry at the time wasn't big. It was just purely trade to trade. So that's why we were so different. We came from a retail background, our family, and we started to present something in a different way. We were not traders. We never sold to other traders, and have never done so in the 30 years. We're a pure end user company. We own all of our own product as well, which is extremely important in this industry, and backing it up and are behind it ourselves. So, but now obviously we buy globally, and I'm contacted every day, and it's a bit of an obsessive thing, and I probably don't go a day without buying something.
Now, have the margins changed, right? I know you have to pass on your costs. If you have to buy the item at a higher price, of course, you have to sell it at a higher price. Like, that's just the way that it works.
Yeah.
But have the margins changed? Does it cost more to service them? Does it cost more to list them and to find customers? Because I know that others have got on the vintage watch craze, especially the Rolex one. And I wonder from a business, because you guys are always very sensitive to those costs and things like that, has it been easier or harder to make money with vintage Rolex, even though prices have generally gone up?
I think if you've been established for the length of time that we have, then no, it's been quite, that journey's been quite steady. I think what people have failed to understand about the watch market is there's the online industry, which we didn't have obviously at the beginning of the store. And I think that's affected the retail price of things. So it's not so much the cost to us, it's people, selling things around the world at varying price points. So it was a lot less stable, the market, because people would see things at different prices and it would be confusing. And then you would have to get into a quality argument and where are these watches coming from and so on, taxation and all different things. So the difficulty nowadays is buying for sure, not selling. So I think sourcing is very hard. The market is mature. So the customers, I suppose, being an end user, are less likely to sell them. And modern watches will always be sold in front of vintage pieces because people appreciate that they are irreplaceable.
Is it hard to sell a vintage Rolex? Like, can someone go to you with a decent one and make money that day? And again, I'm trying to compare it to what you could do with a modern Rolex that you wanted to resell.
Yes, so the same process. People will come to me and as I say, we don't do consignment, we don't do any of those things. If I want it in my collection, I will buy it. You will be paid there and then. And their pieces are very valuable. And if anything, the protection for the consumer, the seller is better than it ever was, because there is an ability for them to find out what their watch is worth via the internet much quicker than they ever could before. There's pure, visibility. You don't buy things at a bargain, if you like. You can't exploit people because within reason you can find out the price, give or take.
Yeah, and that information dynamic has definitely changed things. I've always also been curious, is the brand new Rolex watch a competitor, right? Like, is it fundamentally different customer that buys vintage versus new Rolex? Or in some ways, is it that same person and just depending on taste and price, they go one way or another? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think pre-COVID and post-COVID, this conversation's answer is very different.
Oh, really?
So prior to COVID, the customer was quite different. And I think that what modern Rolex were doing didn't have a huge impact on what we were doing. During COVID and after, this shrinking of availability of product has absolutely sent the whole market, sideways. It's a totally different thing. So the availability of my product, the instant gratification of it, the fact you can walk in and buy your daughter an 18th birthday present, whereas if you walked into Rolex over the last few years, they'd simply just say, oh, here you are, put your name on the list, please. And it's the never, never list, so I call it. It's not a case of you will get something, basically you never will. So that's allowed more of an exposure to the vintage market. And I think people that have bought from us that would never have bought from us before, but have then continued to buy. So yes, that side of it's been very good for us.
I want to move on to talk about the book. You have a stack of, it looks like the current edition and some of the older editions there. But before I do that, I have one more question about the product itself. And I don't know if you have this conversation. I think somebody must when they sell vintage watches versus new ones. But someone comes in wearing a new watch and is curious or eager to buy a vintage one. How do you set their expectations? Because new watches and vintage watches have different considerations for care and maintenance and durability. Like, what kind of speech do you give to someone who's really excited about wearing a vintage watch, but really only has modern watch experience?
Yeah, I suppose depending on the age of the watch that they are looking at, there are caveats in terms of what they can do with them, where they can wear them at the end of the day. They're not necessarily to be worn on beaches, diving, swimming. They are to be kind of looked after. Babied
a little bit.
Yeah, how you look after something, the quality that you keep it in once you leave my store, affects its future value. Obviously, if you destroy that piece over time, it's not going to be the same as when you bought it. I think, but people then get interested in the kind of psyche of the vintage pieces, the allure of them, and the feel, which is so different. They just feel special and elegant and lightweight most of the time. So you pick up things and you look like a hunk of a watch is put on the table and you're about to pick it up and you think it's going to be really heavy like all the modern pieces, and it's like paper. And people, every day you get that same reaction from somebody. So that's within reason. People can do what they like with them, but there's that caveat that there's value, perceived value, and going forward, more and more value is growing with those pieces.
Is there a special way to baby them that you recommend? Always wear sleeves, careful about walls. I mean, it might sound silly, but not everyone's thinking about that.
No, I think if you're a collector, then that would be in your psyche. But if you're just a wearer, you wouldn't even. I mean, I wouldn't even consider that to be. Oh, don't wear sleeves or something like that. Yeah, no, not.
It's because I see, at least over the last several years, out and about in the world, a lot of people, men and women, wearing vintage Rolex. And I know that they're not someone who's like classically a vintage watch collector. Like they couldn't sit there and have a conversation about it with you. But somewhere along the line, they heard from somewhere that vintage was cool, or they had a friend or whatever, they were curious, and they got one. And you could tell that it's great they're supporting the community, but they wouldn't really necessarily know how to properly take care of it. They just think it's sort of another average watch. And so since the last several years, as you said, has birthed a large number of these vintage curious types, sometimes similar with cars, right? Expectations need to be set because, a 1960s sports car sure as hell is not going to operate like a sports car from today.
Well, no, maybe in cars, but in watches, they're better made.
Sure.
So they actually, if you were to ask these same people about the Rolex, watchmaking side, no one's going to particularly brag about it being the best in the world today necessarily. But the vintage pieces actually are better made. They're more, they are handmade in most cases. They're not on automated systems. So from the mechanical perspective, that's fine. I think where did all these people suddenly come from? I will tell you that there is a monumental turning point within the vintage market. It is, I think, 2017. It is the sale of Paul Newman's own Paul Newman for $17 million in auction in New York at Phillips. And that was the turning point. That put vintage onto the front page of every single newspaper, every media outlet, in a way that had never, ever been before. So I can tell you for my market, that is the turning point. And you've got the, Paul Newman allure watches and vintage, and the word vintage and Rolex brought together for the first time globally. And this huge sum of money, 17 million. And people are like, hello, what is this all about? What market is this? And that's what brought so many people into that.
Yeah, a lot of these big numbers around watches received a fair amount of news, and that was a massive number. I remember seeing the watch. It was here in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
For the Academy Museum opening, and it's pretty, but it's an unassuming timepiece. You know what I mean? To understand that someone paid 17 million for it, you need to get a lot of backstory there. And it makes people curious. I think that's what's interesting is they see this watch and they're like, wait, that money? But why? But why? And then they get hooked in. And I've always found with watches, the price point, not necessarily 17 million, even just a few $1,000s. For a lay consumer, they're like, it's pretty and I understand it, but I don't understand why it costs that much. I'd like to know why. That hooks in a lot of people, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I always say that Paul Newman did for Rolex and watches what Elizabeth Taylor did for jewelry. They are the same iconic pieces and had the same impact, if you like. That's the way I can help describe it to people. So for the watch industry, that's
I don't know nearly as much about jewelry as I do watches. I know who Elizabeth Taylor is, and I know that she had some, but what was her special claim to fame in jewelry popularization?
So some of the most famous diamonds in the world that she wore, her love affair with Richard Burton, and the whole him buying her jewelry, and then her jewelry came up again at auction in a 2-volume, very, very special piece that she collected over the years. And, there was a very famous, because obviously a UK story of her was that she sat at a dinner party with Princess Margaret, and she was wearing her huge diamond of tens of carats, enormous.
Wow.
And Princess Margaret said to her, "That's rather vulgar, isn't it?" So Elizabeth Taylor takes it off her finger, puts it onto Princess Margaret's finger, and then says, "Not so vulgar now."
Very good. Did that work?
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? It's something from perception, but when you're actually wearing it, she was an enthusiast. She did love jewelry. So
that's a great line.
Paul Newman had the story. So the watch was given to him, had the inscription on the back, and it was a rare watch to begin with. That style of Daytona, Cosmograph Daytona from the 1960s, 1970s, by Rolex design was called the exotic dial. So there was a retail piece. It did have a slight variant in color and design. And it was a sexy piece that came associated with Daytona racetrack in America with racing, and him wearing it was a game changer.
Do a lot of people know that the Daytona was rare because it was a commercial failure and they didn't make that many?
People know now, yeah. It's kind of a folklore, if you like, that people talk about. And interestingly, when you do find some original pieces with their paperwork, bill of sale, production date versus sale date, you're talking 5 or 6 years, sometimes 7, sometimes 10-year gap.
Oh, wow.
Between, so it's extraordinary. People look at and don't really understand. And you have to start explaining, well, this watch wasn't popular. People weren't prepared for the 3-dial styling, and they were basically unsaleable in Rolex stores.
I think one of the interesting pieces of the story that I learned was really not so much about design or price or anything like that, but at the time, it was the automatic chronograph, which was the hot, new, sexy mechanical thing, and the Daytona at the time was still a manually wound chronograph. So it wasn't as competitive because it had yesterday's technology. Rolex hadn't updated it yet. I have no idea how many years it would be until they would have an automatic chronograph. Was that not until like the 90s or something like that with the Zenith one?
I think the Zenith is 1987, the first Zenith. So
okay.
The series of these Paul Newman Daytona pieces versus the Zenith movement, late 80s.
Yeah.
And often people came into the stores, and once the Zenith had come in, I remember buying a watch from a customer that was given the choice. He could buy this new automatic piece or they discount the old model if he wanted it, because they just wanted to get rid of them. So he bought 2 of the old ones, and fortunately for him, that was the right decision.
And at the time, no one would have known. I think that's what's fascinating with a lot of these vintage Rolexes. At the time, it would have been nearly impossible for anyone to understand that I should get this because in the future, it's going to be worth a lot of money. Whether it was a very rare sub-variant you didn't know was rare that was only sold in certain parts of the world, or the way it aged, or how you got it through some military thing, or because it was just something like that. But like, correct me if I'm wrong, but like, there's no way of going back in time and like, doing it. Nobody would have been able to tell that these would have been collectible.
No, but in a way, isn't that nicer? I mean,
it's great.
I'm not necessarily sure that I like the way the industry changed, and the fact that you could walk into Rolex, buy something and walk around the corner and flip it instantaneously for several £1,000s. Is that right? I'm not sure.
I mean, I'm not into that as well. That doesn't make it fun. I just think it's interesting in the world of limited edition and special edition, and for the collectors and for the enthusiasts, they're trying to build in the suggestion of collectability. Yeah. And what we know is that the authentically collectible stuff is collectible because no one really thought of it as ever being collectible. They didn't make a lot because it was expensive or it was an accident. It wasn't like it was made as a limited edition because they knew it was going to be hot. Like, no, it didn't work that way at all.
Yeah, I agree. And the what pieces that they do today in those numbers in other brands, I think, yeah, that purpose it's a shame.
So we'll all wait 80 years from now, right, to see which of the limited editions for today are valuable then. So let's talk about the book. Now, thank you so much for sending one of these out. The book is called Vintage Rolex, the largest collection in the world. New edition. I guess this is the 4th edition by David Silver of the Vintage Watch Company. And I have to say, I've seen multiple books on Rolex. This is a very attractive one. Also very comprehensive. I'll allow you to talk about it in a minute here, but I just want to describe what I think you're trying to do with it. First, you try to create a little bit of the basis. Is why is vintage Rolex cool? You have some pictures of it on celebrities and some of the iconic, imagery that everyone associates who loves it. Then you go into catalog through original photography that's very consistent, just tons and tons of models, and you categorize them the way that collectors do. Not the way that Rolex does, but the way that collectors do. And I really, really think that's great. What else do I need to know about how this book is organized and what you're trying to convey with it?
Yeah, nothing. I mean, it's purely a visual archive, if you like. It was created because I had done all the photography in-house for our own website. So
yeah.
It was by accident that the archive was obviously growing. You've straight away recognized the uniformity of photography, which for me is everything. So the fact that they are professionally shot to a very, very detailed level, the consistency of the book is a kind of a marvel for people to look at. It's beautifully shot. It would be an uneconomic project to produce from scratch if that photography did not exist.
Right.
So it's just a kind of byproduct. Every single piece here has been through our hands, so it has meaning to me and to the store. And it's a handpicked, kind of collection and curation of Rolex over the years, which no one will ever see in one place. So basically, there's lots of books out there. There's lots of books on watches and Rolex themselves, but very few focus on the first 50 years, if you like, because that market's never that strong. But that's the basis of the book that people find extraordinary, that those watches existed, that they look so tank-like in shape, or ladies' diamond pieces, or the First World War pieces, officers' watches. That's the height of Rolex in terms of winning records and producing landmark pieces and their exploration, the 1950s and all the sport models and everything. So this is their history. This is where everything comes from. So what people, an 18-year-old that is growing up now and going straight into Rolex's window doesn't really know any of this history. And I want them to know that the brand, I'm the most passionate of Rolex because there's just so much to explore, really.
I mean, spending some time with this book is a cheat sheet to learning about the evolution of Rolex. It allows you to see not just the model families, but the slow evolution. I think that's what's great about all the pictures of the various explorers, for example, or submariners. Like, you see the very slight evolution. You're like, oh, Rolex has always been evolving slowly. But you also see things that they did for a small amount of time that were really cool that they've never done again. And you can see how we always kind of laugh about how some of the looks like they Frankenstein themselves, right? Like, oh, it's just this watch, but with an extra hand, right? But they've sort of always done that. They're like, how about we put that bezel over here? How about we put those hands over here? And I think that looking at this collection together allows you to quickly realize really what the aesthetic DNA of vintage Rolex is. In like just a couple of minutes with this book, you can save yourself, I don't know, thousands and thousands of hours of online research, because as you said, you put it all together. And I want to repeat what you said. There's no place where you could go to see all these watches together. They're just too rare. They're too valuable. One thing I want to clarify is, and you mentioned sort of the first 50 years, maybe that's the answer, but what is vintage to you? Because at some point you don't go into anything that looks like the 21st century. Where does this cut off exactly?
So obviously nothing that is in production today. So I stretched it. I suppose we now have pieces in the store that are 20 years old, 20, 25 years old, comes into kind of a vintage category. I think the pure vintage, if you like, the kind of 70s and 80s has to be the kind of image of particularly date models, things, the very colorful pieces. That's the kind of height of those. And then Daytona models, 60s and 70s. And then in the 1950s, you've got the Submariner entry points of all the sport watches, the GMT, the Explorer, as you said before. So yeah, but then the price point of those pieces is high. The entry level for 1950s sport models is pretty high. So that's not obviously for everybody, but yeah, it's creeping. But then people always say to me, oh, if I buy this watch today, 20 years time, you'll be selling it. And I don't know about that anymore, because it's more about the volume of production.
I think the problem actually is with the term, because vintage is a beautiful sounding term, but as you know, it's in your business name. It's a very versatile term, which is used quite liberally. So there's a particular era of Rolex's production that you're most interested in. It's not the watch is X amount of years old. It has to do with the era that it was produced. Maybe right now you can think of a better term. Would you call that the original era? The Hans Wilsdorf plus X amount of years era? Because I think that vintage is too loose of a term to specify where you're a specialist in.
Yeah, possibly. But I think it's become such a widely recognized term now. And I think that vintage and Rolex, more than any other brands, have come together as a concept. It's almost a brand within itself now. So when you see the words next to each other, they are drummed into the psyche. And I think every other word it slightly downgrades the Rolex name, if you like. We're all about the kind of style and typography, and for me, that is the concept. I can't imagine another word slotting alongside it.
Well, you're the marketer. I'm the academic here, right? I want it to be accurate and unsexy, and you're like, well, it's got to sell well.
Absolutely, it's got, and I think that would be the difference. But I don't know what else you would call it. Secondhand is a horrible word. Used is a horrible word.
I think the era.
Which is what people.
Maybe just Rolex before, again, I'm just throwing out a number, Rolex before 1990.
Yeah.
Rolex 20 whatever to, 1990. That could be a way, just a time frame to chronologically segment it in. I'm just saying, in the future, two people could be having a conversation. I love vintage Rolex. And then they realize they're thinking about completely different types of products. Like that could happen.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
Not convinced, but I understand.
Okay. Look, categories will happen whether we like it or not. It's just a matter of getting ahead of the curve. And maybe you could be, David Silver's collection. They always think about that. He's the one that really set these dates out. Then you'll be famous that way.
Yeah, I think we are responsible for that term. Definitely. I agree.
So let's talk about what's missing in the book. Is there anything from this era that you're like, it's just never come through here? I've never been able to shoot it, but I want it for a future edition?
No.
Really?
It's an interesting question, yeah. So generally, if it's not in here, I never wanted it.
So you've got everything you've ever wanted. Lucky you.
At that point, could I do it now? Probably not. So there's sections of the book Paul Newman watches the end where once the pieces started to hit £1 million, $1 million each, would we be in a position to be holding 20 of them? Probably not now. So yeah, that market's changed. So is this, again, is a moment in time? Is a lot of this recreatable now due to value? No, probably not. So
you were lucky when these watches were still expensive, but not nearly as expensive they are now, that you had to trade. You had a chance to trade them. Correct. Okay, so some of the Daytonas, that's a good example. What else is something that you couldn't rebuy it now for a reasonable price?
It's not that the price is reasonable. That it's reasonable for what it is. It's just a whole, from a retail perspective, it's a whole nother market of customer. And, the watches is very interesting. You sub $20,000 watches has a wide market, $20,000 to $30,000, so on. You go over $50,000 for an individual purchase of a watch, it's a different profile of customer. $100,000, $200,000, $1 million watches. You can answer the question yourself. It's going to be quite a small number of people that would want to spend the amount of money, regardless of whether they have it.
I'm just curious which watches, other than the Daytona, has skyrocketed in value. I know that some of the military submariners
pieces,
have.
Yeah, military submariners for sure. Colorful watches, the Stellar Dials, these pieces that are on the front cover are hugely valuable compared to when we were selling them at the time. So I think to do collections of them, which was something we passionately did all the time. Everything in the book's real. This collection is one person's collection of colorful pieces.
So beautiful.
To recreate that box now, to even find the watch is near impossible. To sell them to one person, near impossible. The value would be several million. And so that's the side of it that I suppose is changed a lot, because people can't maybe have as much fun as they used to with them, because you can't buy so many pieces.
I remember several years ago, I was traveling in Italy, and somebody said something funny. It's a bit crude, but it was true at the time. And what they said was, Italy, where all Rolex watches go to die. And what they meant by it was, like, every old Rolex, no matter what it was or what condition it was, would be valued by somebody in Italy to wear, because you get them for not a lot of money. And it was not the desirable ones. It was, again, smaller, older ones that just, again, at the time were not popular. Now, that's different. And so what I'm curious about is that person who 15, 20 years ago would have been able to spend literally just a few $100s often to get like a vintage Rolex. What are they wearing now? It's probably still vintage something. Those Rolexes are worth a lot more now. Do you have any insight on what those people are wearing these days?
I would probably be very controversial answers if I started to name the brands that those people are wearing, because everyone would probably get upset. I think Tudor, probably, the vintage Tudor market, definitely has grown on the strength of the Rolex market. And then obviously other brands like Omega and Hoya, Tag Heuer, the Hoya from the past, but still they're very niche. So I think there's still that feeling if you didn't get the Rolex, I don't know what else was being worn, but
it's not very easily replaced. It's just I'm quite cognizant that those same people can't afford Rolex today, right? Because it's just so much more popular, those models, because we remember what they were. Like, they were just not worth that much. They were smaller. Men wouldn't want to wear them. You'd have to find the right woman that would want to wear a vintage watch. But correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of those, of course, have gone up in value in accordance with Rolex in general going up in value.
Yeah, but I think there's still a vast majority of the pieces are within a range that people would buy a modern watch for. So I think it's still accessible.
Okay, so those deals are still out there.
Yeah. I think, we would have arguments over what's considered accessible in terms of value, but I think that modern watch price, Rolex's price point, brand new in store, there are pieces for that price in vintage and less. So, if you want a luxury watch, the vintage is still accessible.
Now that new Rolex watches are slowly but surely becoming more available, is that having any effect on the vintage watch market, or is it really different markets, as I assume it is much of the time?
I mean, in theory, it should. But at the moment, the pieces that are becoming available, there's a question mark as to why those pieces are available. And the consumer is absolutely confused, if I'm honest. So,
really?
Yeah. So I'm not sure. I would say it's slightly counterproductive what's happened, because if your psyche is, if I put it another way, if every time you've tried to get into a restaurant, you've been told it's full, the list is months long, and you saved up and you special occasion and it's in the diary and you go. But then suddenly a few months later, it's like, oh yeah, we have a table on Tuesday. Look forward to seeing you. Be like, oh, what happened? Did the chef change? Why is it suddenly something
interesting
available?
So what's the right way of saying now we want to do business with you? What's the right way of doing it but making them still feel special?
I don't know. I think it's going to take some time for them to readjust, because the pieces that people really, really, really want are still not available. Okay.
So it's an interesting issue, because it's like you can't make them happy either way. You sell them the watch, they're not happy. You don't sell them the watch, they're not happy.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you win?
I wouldn't want to be in that business. No, absolutely. I agree. And it's not even really necessarily if they're making originally, but definitely I think everyone manipulated it. As production started to increase, people still kept those availability lists small. And I think it's across the whole kind of luxury industry. It's not just Rolex.
Speaking of weird psychology, I noticed something strange over the last several years, and I wondered if this was an outcome. So London especially, and other parts of the world had sad stories in the news for some thefts and things like that of watches. Sometimes people would have a watch stolen off their wrist, and a lot of law enforcement really stepped up and started getting a lot of that clamped down. And a lot of people understandably were afraid to wear Rolexes and other popular luxury watches in certain metropolitan areas. But then here's what my suspicion was. My suspicion is that it would also have the effect of making it sort of this dangerous taboo thing, and it would make you want to make other people want to wear Rolex all the more. Did you notice that while some people were scared to wear the Rolex, it kind of teased a different group of people into like, hey, maybe you want a Rolex because it's a danger now to do so?
Yeah, there's certainly certain people in the world that won't be told what to do by society or anybody else. And I think, funnily enough, I would say that's a very American ideology that, we'll kind of do what we want to do. And I think traveling to America a lot, which I do, the feeling of openness and the ability to wear anything you want wherever you are is very strong for me. That I feel that here I think it's coming back now. People are definitely relaxing about that. Some bad situations got an awful lot of coverage, and I think it's very sad, but that's down to policing and a lot of other things too. It's a lot of problems that we have crime related that need sorting. Absolutely.
I think what's amazing about this conversation is the dynamic way that watches have become popular, but have also become other conversations. It's not just about how nice it is to wear watches. Popularity of watches related to how expensive they become, or famous auctions, or famous people that are seen wearing them, or maybe some of the danger and crime around them, how people are stealing watches. I remember reading about how criminals are using watches as currency. They're not even selling them. Yeah. They're just using them as currency, which is kind of amazing. And it all coalesces into sort of this larger zeitgeist conversation that creates demand. And you don't know exactly how it's going to affect a consumer, but once they hear about this dynamic conversation, they become curious and could possibly end up at your door. And that's sort of how buyers are made, because as the industry likes to remind us, Ariel and David, people aren't making watches to tell the time anymore. So there's this complicated emotional dynamic of what goes into the demand creation. And it's always worth talking about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But also things like, did you ever think you'd be talking about the fact that there are hedge funds pegged to watches? Did you think that the crypto market would have any influence whatsoever in watch values? It does. Would you be talking about interest rates globally, and why would that in any way affect watch pricing? It does. What the bubble that's popped, if you like, over the last few years in modern watch prices had absolutely nothing to do with anybody that was passionate about watches. It's crypto money. It was the Ukrainian-Russian war suddenly had an influence. Unbelievable world events on just a watch that you put on your wrist, and you. So what world are we in? Well, we are now in a economic world that is completely pegged to value. It's extraordinary.
And it's funny because in the context of luxury and watches, we never want to talk about politics. I mean, you've been to the shows, you've been to Basel Worlds and stuff like that. No one ever wanted to talk about what's going on in the outside world. But now more than ever, the outside world has a massive impact on the luxury space and the watch space. And it's ironic and it's worth discussing from time to time because it's interconnected no matter how much we want to have feel-good conversations and think that these are celebratory items, which they are, but it's just more dynamic than that.
Yeah, but I think the watch has just become that transportable piece that, unfortunately generations in the past that are, more exposed to wartime conflicts necessarily, than us, also had tangible value. They had coins, they had gold, they had, that was diamonds, just, as important. So I suppose historically there was always a product-based system, but we didn't expect it to be Rolex watches.
I want to talk about the book again, and I have one more question. How can people buy this book? Obviously, they can go into your store and see it. Is this for sale? How do you use this book as part of your larger business model?
Yeah, so the book is available across all websites for books and a lot of stores worldwide. So it's not my first book. The first one came out in 2020 to celebrate 25 years of the store. That sold enormously, far outweighed what I ever imagined. So the books kind of stand alone to me, which is quite amazing. And they're a coffee table piece, and you can pretty much get them anywhere globally. And then there's a limited edition run of special colored covers that celebrate the 30 years in business. So these will become a little bit rare in their own right. These are all stellar dials, which, as everyone kind of knows now, is my passion. And you'll be able to get hold of those. But the main kind of cover is obviously purple. America's my biggest market for the book.
It's a really nice book. I have to say the quality of the pages, the print, it's just nice to look through. And I've seen a lot of watch books, so we don't need to dwell on it. But the book is Vintage Rolex, Amazon, or as David said, where books are sold. If you're into vintage watches or vintage Rolex or Rolex, it's hard not to recommend to put this one in your collection. It's a very nice collection of timepieces. I want to go back to the Vintage Watch Company business. On the website, again, that same fantastic photography. So it's actually really nice just to look at the Rolex watches there. But in terms of the future direction, the world is getting more connected, very competitive. Some of these watches are harder to get. What changes do you anticipate having to make moving forward in order to maintain the stature that you have? You're very well respected. You have an amazing collection. How do you maintain that moving forward in a world where you have to be agile and dynamic?
Yeah, in two different ways. The most important way is kind of location and founding. So we've actually extended our lease recently in the Burlington Arcade. We are even more established here as a location in London, as a destination. The absolute key to the entire concept is that it be available and be seen. Yes, websites are fantastic. Instagram's amazing. Social media is amazing, but there's nothing quite like turning up and seeing everything side by side lined up in one place. And, we will continue to do that, even as everyone keeps telling us that the global online market's bigger and bigger and bigger. I want people to come here. And, as people are traveling back to normal, as people do come. London is a hub for that, and I'm very lucky to be established here.
How is the tourism over the last 24 months been in London? I know that England charges Americans money now to enter. We have to do some weird electronic reservation thing.
Yeah, which we've been doing with you, Pete.
Really? I had no idea.
Yeah, that's a very recent thing. Not a huge amount, but tourism is very strong. Yeah, it's very, very strong. As I say, US to UK, US to Europe over the last 18 months, you will have seen some of the largest exit figures from the US that you've ever had. If you were to look into to that. So I think a traveling population from America is huge now, and important for us.
Awesome. Well, the next time I'm in London, I'm looking forward to checking it out. The store is the Vintage Watch Company. It's located in the, I guess, famous Burlington Arcade in London, and the place that you want to be, right? In the high street. The website is vintagewatchcompany.com. And this has been the Superlative Podcast interview with the owner, David Silver. David, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.